So, Namaskar. Today we shall discuss the last part of this series on Taj Mahal. In the very first part, we discussed the historical documents, by which I mean the court papers of Shah Jahan and the contemporary travelogues of some of the European travelers who visited Agra during those years of Shah Jahan. And in the second part, as well as the third part, we looked at two important features, the characteristic features of supposed to be Mughal architecture. One was the minaret and another was the dome. And we made extensive presentation on the history of minarets and noted that the minarets of Taj Mahal were not Islamic minarets. The Islamic minaret is erected on a mosque, and usually it is a single minaret. But Taj Mahal is a tomb and it has 4 minarets, and the adjacent mosque does not have any minarets at all. And studying carefully, we trace the entire history of Islamic architecture in India, starting from Qutbuddin Aibak, 1190-93. Qutbuddin Aibak built a mosque after pulling down some 20-30 temples in Ajmer. In 93, that is 1193, he did a similar act in Delhi. The Ajmer mosque, he built an extra screen, they call it screen, in front of the mosque where they built minarets. But the minarets fell off due to faulty construction. And in Delhi, they did not attempt that at all. And following this fiasco at Ajmer, the Pathan architecture, not only the slave dynasty, but also the later dynasties like the Tughlaq and the Khiljis and the Lodis, they did not attempt building minarets at all. Their mosques are depleted of minarets. They did not even attempt. And the first few generations of the Mughal architecture also, in the first few generations, in the sense, Babur in 1526, Humayun subsequently in 1530 to 1540. Then there was an interlude of about 12 years or so when Sher Shah Suri occupied the throne at Delhi. And again, Humayun took over, but it did not last very long. In a very, very short time, he died. So Babur, Humayun, and Akbar, of whom Babur built the Babri Masjid, or Mir Baqi built the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. And Akbar built 2 important buildings. One is the Humayun's tomb in Delhi. Another is his own tomb, which is called Sikandara. He commandeered a building and built his own tomb. Both these buildings do not contain any minarets. And Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar had conquered Fatehpur Sikri and occupied it for a short time before he abandoned it because it was too small a township which could not accommodate Akbar's capital. So within a very short time, he abandoned that, Fatehpur Sikri, but there he built certain buildings, but they do not contain minarets. The minaret is seen in the Mughal style, or so to say, the Indo-Saracenic style, with the exception of the attempt at Ajmer. For the first time, it is seen in the Taj Mahal. And Taj Mahal is a commandeered building But after Taj Mahal was commandeered, Shah Jahan's later building contained minarets. Aurangzeb's building contained minarets. So the minaret was a feature adopted from the Taj Mahal. Historically, the first 440 years of the Islamic architecture in India did not contain minarets. And the minarets of Taj Mahal are the minarets of a tomb, if you want to say. Otherwise, they were the ornamental minarets of an existing building. Subsequently, in the next part, we looked at the dome, and there are varieties of domes. All domes are not Islamic domes. Indian Shilpa Shastras also talk about domes, and they talk about the various sections of the domes very systematically. And the dome of the Taj Mahal is very special in the sense only the Taj Mahal and the later buildings after Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, they attempted to build that kind of a dome. The name of this dome is known as the Bulbas Dome, the like of which cannot be found in Akbar's architecture or Babur's architecture, nor in the architecture of Samarkand, as claimed by James Ferguson. So the bulbous dome, which resembles an onion bulb, at the bottom as well as at the top, there are lotus flowers, is distinctly Indian Shilpa Shastra description. And the arrangement of domes, that is the 5 domes, is said to be the Pancharatna style of constructions, and different arrangements, different buildings, different types of domes arranged in Pancharatna style are seen in India as well as in Java, Prambanam, Java. In fact, E.B. Havel says the precursor of the Taj arrangement of domes, that is the Pancharatna style of construction, can be seen in the Chandi Seva temple at Prambanam in Java. And the date of Chandi Seva temple, he says, he borrows a study and agrees with that and says it is 1192. That is about 500 years prior to Shah Jahan. Thus far we have come. Now, if you look at the historical documents, it appears that it is Raja Man Singh's palace because of 2 places. Very distinctly, Shah Jahan's paper itself claims it to be Man Singh's palace. One is in Badshahnama and another is in a farman which he issued 2 years later. And he gave 4 Havelis in exchange of this building complex. 2 places. There is no reason for us to disbelieve his claims. But the world at large, historians at large, claim or classify Taj Mahal as Mughal style of building, mainly because of the architectural features, that is the minarets and the domes, which they believe to have been contributed by or derived from the Islamic style of construction. So if the documents are saying this and you believe something else, and what you believe has become history, entered in our books as history, Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. Against Shah Jahan's own assertion, that is, the legend has become history for us, or replaced history for us. And it is important and interesting to see how this took place, how this displacement of actual history by a legend took place in the historical perspective. Today we shall discuss that why a legend was given the position of history. That's why the title of this part is The Genesis of the Legend. I would also call it the European historiography, because It is the European pundits during the 19th century who formulated this idea and presented it as history. Even though there were evidences to the contrary, what the evidences which we are seeing, those evidences were available for them, yet they concluded that this must have been Mughal architecture. We shall examine the process. I use two words here, racism and negationism. Racism would mean a widespread assumption during the 19th century, which colored the outlook of scholars. In fact, very great scholars were prejudiced by racism during the 19th century. Very many of them. And a consequence of this racial superiority could be seen in the Aryan invasion theory also. The other word is negationism, which is coined in the 20th century by Europeans only, to say that, see, there is a class of historians and intellectuals in Europe who denied the genocide of the Jews in Germany. They started justifying it. Hitler's race theory and his Aryan superiority theory. They started justifying that and they denied that the atrocities and the genocide that happened of something like 6 to 7 million Jews, they would downplay that, do not find fault with that, but justify that. That is known as negationism, denying the actual fact in defense of an ideology. A similar approach, a negationism, can be seen in India also, to deny the atrocities that have happened in India during the last several centuries under the Islamic rule, the Pathan rule for 330 years, 33, 34 years, and then the Mughal rule for another 300 years. So some 600 years of Islamic rule from Delhi. Whatever the atrocities that have happened, they are downplayed and they are glorified as great emperors, great kings, and great Indians. They were actually invaders, but projected as great patriots and Indians. That is called negationism. So we can see a combination of both these in what has happened in the European historiography during the 19th century. Perhaps the most important name in Indian archaeology is James Ferguson. James Ferguson was the one who classified Indian architecture and said, okay, this is Islamic, this is Indian. He classified it into 13 different categories actually, but then the broad classification is what is come from Samarkand, what has come from Persia, what has come from Ghazni, etc. He classified into 13 groups, 13 categories. He wrote 3 books, 1855, 1867, 1876. And his classification was questioned soon after he presented, maybe about 30, 40 years later. E.B. Havel, Ernest Havel, a professor of history who lived in India for about 11 years and who wrote a very scholarly book where he very emphatically questioned Ferguson's classification. But Havel's ideas did not take root in the official history circles. James Ferguson's classification still rule even today. It was James Ferguson who classified the Mughal architecture or the Taj Mahal as the Mughal architecture and called Taj Mahal as the epitome of Mughal architecture. Whenever they say what are the features of Mughal architecture, what comes to your mind, what comes to their mind, whoever describes it, is the Taj Mahal. It is a Taj Mahal which is taken as the model of Mughal architecture in India, and description of Mughal architecture is given from there. Therefore, it is important to look at the manner in which he drew his conclusions. Racism would mean the assumption that the mankind can be divided into 4 classes according to their intellectual capacity and potential. The 4 classes are the racism believed. I'm talking about the 19th century racism. Today also, the racism is present across the world in various forms, but not very explicitly. People would not express it openly. But during the 19th century, I'm talking nearly 150 years ago, it was very prevalent and it colored the outlook of scholars, especially European scholars. The racism assumes that humankind is of 4 categories. When I say categories, it is based on their intellectual capacity. And this intellectual capacity is reflected in the color of their skin. And topmost in this hierarchy comes the European of white skin color. And next comes the yellow skin, the Chinese and maybe Japanese. And the third comes the brown-skinned Indians. And fourth come the Africans. This is called racism. You can identify the capacity of people. I'm not talking individual, but then as people, you can identify their capacity, their potential, their abilities based on the color of their skin. You look at them, you can make out whether they belong to the higher class or the lower class. That is called racism. I don't have to repeat that. Europeans come first according to the racial theory. Now, Ferguson says that India was attacked by the northern hordes. Please note these words, I have highlighted them. And they are of Turanian blood. This classification is based on the European Pundits classification, especially Max Muller identified 3 great races. One of them is called Turanian. You can call them Turanian. You can call them as Turks, the Turkish people. Semites. Semites means Semitic people. That is to the east of Turkey, Jerusalem, Asia Minor, and then Mediterranean region that is known as Semitic region. The people living there are called Semitic people or Semites. And the third one is Aryans. Aryans belong to Central Europe, and most of the Europeans are of Aryan stock. This is a classification of Max Muller, believed by European pundits. And the belief was so strong that in Germany, later Hitler said Aryans were superior race. Yes, it is superior race. And he was trying to cleanse the German nation of the inferior Semitic people, that is the Jews. And Ferguson labored under the assumption that the Turkish people are superior to the inferior stock of India, because they were closer to the Europeans. They are not as superior as the Aryans. That is the red-blooded Europeans, but they are next only to the Aryans. That was his assumption. They were certainly superior to Indians, and this can be seen in his conclusions, in his logic. Regarding the Afghan architecture or the Pathan architecture, that is the architecture built in India during the first 330 years of the Sultanate rule, that is the Sultans, the Khiljis and the Lodis and the Tughlaqs. This is known as the Pathan architecture. That time is known as Afghan architecture or Pathan architecture. Says Ferguson, the architecture of the nations under the Arab Khilafat. He is saying that these Turks came from the West, yes, but they did not build much there. The Arab Khilafat did not have architecture of any great importance. He says architecture of the nations under the Arab Caliphate is of very minor importance. The ruling people were of Semitic race. You see the racism coming into this, and had no great taste for architectural magnificence. The Semites did not have architectural taste. But with the northern hordes, now Islam spread from Arabia to Turkey and the north. And many of these hordes means people who were nomadic, they were not staying in one place, but they were moving from place to place. They are more ferocious, but superior in intellect and talent. This is what Ferguson's conclusions were. With the northern hordes, the case was widely different. They were of Turanian blood, more or less pure, and wherever they went, their mosques, especially their tombs, remained to mark their presence and convey an idea of their splendor. It is necessary to bear in mind that the Turanian conquest from Bukhara to Balkh, as centers extended from Constantinople to Cuttack. Cuttack is in India, in Orissa. So he's talking about Constantinople to Cuttack, and covered the whole intervening space with monuments of every class. Nothing could be more brilliant, says Ferguson. Nothing could be more brilliant and at the same time more characteristic than the commencement of the architectural career of these Pathans in India. See, they did not have any architecture in their native place. They were nomads. But Ferguson credits them with the great architectural instincts. He says, nothing could be more brilliant and at the same time more characteristic than the commencement of the architectural career of these Pathans in India. So soon as they felt themselves at all sure of their conquest, they set to work to erect two great mosques in their two principal capitals of Ajmer and Delhi, of such magnificence as should resound to the glory of their religion and mark their triumph over the idolaters. I'll show you the two great mosques, the pictures of the great mosques which they built. But before that, let us see what Ferguson has to say. He further says, a nation of soldiers equipped for conquest They were ferocious. They are warriors. They had no hesitation in arson and loot. And they did all that. And he says, a nation of soldiers equipped for conquest. And that only. They had, of course, brought with them neither artists nor architects. But like other nations of Turanian origin, they had strong architectural instincts, and having a style of their own, they could hardly go wrong in any architectural project they might attempt. Like other nations of Turanian origin, they had strong architectural instincts. At the same time, they found among their new subjects an infinite number of artists quite capable of carrying out any design that might be propounded to them. Please note his logic. He says that the Turks had the instinct and they had the capacity to command, whereas the Indians provided the labor and also the artistic talent capable of carrying out any design that might be propounded to them. And how many? An infinite number of artists. Indirectly, he is saying that there is a great architectural tradition in India. Otherwise, how will you have infinite number of artists? So India had the architectural tradition, but the Turks exploited them as masters, as conquerors. This is the Adhai Dinka Jhompra in Ajmer. Jhompra means a building, not a major edifice. Jhompra means an ordinary building. But it is called Adhai Dinka Jhompra, 2.5 days. Built by Qutbuddin Aibak in 1192. So the first phase of that was over in about 60 hours. That is 2.5 days. How did they do it? They destroyed some 20-30 temples. And Ferguson says nothing could be more brilliant and at the same time more characteristic than the commencement of the architectural career of these Pathans in India. This is the beginning. And if you look at the buildings, look at the pillars there, they're all Hindu temple pillars, Hindu and Jain. And when I say Hindu, I mean Jain also. Temple pillars containing all carvings which is appropriate for a temple. They dismantled or destroyed many buildings and constructed this. And Ferguson says it is characteristic of them and it's a brilliant work. This is the screen outside. I mentioned to you a screen. This is called the screen. Outside the mosque can be seen behind, the dome of the mosque can be seen behind. And here they built minarets. See, there is the remains of a minaret. They fell off. They fell off due to faulty constructions. Perhaps this was built by the invading Turks, or rather Indian slave labor working under invading Turks. So the building apparently is beautiful, but it is, the minarets are certainly an afterthought. After the building is completed or the screen is completed, they thought of building minarets. It doesn't carry foundation. Otherwise, normally minarets should begin with a foundation on the ground. So they fell off. This is the temple, this is the mosque built by temple ruins in Delhi. It is called Kawat-ul-Islam Mosque. And a plaque of the Archaeological Survey of India says that it is built after destroying 27 Hindu and Jain temples. And Ferguson classifies them as characteristic as brilliant and great inception of the Pathan architecture. This is the Qutub Minar. If you see the Qutub Minar also, see the lower 3 floors of the Qutub Minars, lower 3 stories of the Qutub Minar here. They are of a different architectural style than the upper 2. These are ornate, they have a design, but the upper one is plain and bald, but erected over either pull down minaret or pull down building, or it contained only 3 stories and they built over that. It is very unlikely that they contain only 3. It is likely that it had 5, but they have pulled it down, but then they again reconstructed 2 of them as a mark of their glory, their own glory. Yeah, this is the upper part of the Qutub Minar. The style is entirely different. You would see it is very bald. Yeah. Says Ferguson, giving compliments after compliments, he says, in the first place, they means the Turks, found in the colonnaded courts of the Jaina temples nearly all that was wanted for a ready-made mosque. All that was required was the removal of the temple in its center and the erection of a new wall on the west side, adorned with rich niche, mihrabs, to point out to the faithful the direction in which Mecca lay, towards which they were commanded in the Quran to turn when they prayed. It is certain, however, that in India, they never were content with this only. In the 2 instances, at least to which we are now referring, they determined, in addition, to erect a screen of arches in front of the Jaina pillars and to adorn it with all the richness and elaboration of carving which their Indian subjects were capable of executing. It is only the limit of the Indian artisans that decided what is to be included there. Nothing could be more successful than the results. There is a largeness and grandeur about the plain, simple outline of the Mohammedan arches, which quite overshadows the smaller parts of the Hindu fanes. Hindu fanes are small. Islamic largeness and grandeur are brought by the Turks. I mean, this thought of largeness and grandeur attributed to the invaders is quite current in the minds of Indian scholars. I mean, we have been told about this again and again. Ferguson uses strange logic. He calls them the northern hordes, nomads, barbarians, who had no architectural tradition, which also explicitly stated by him. But then says they were a nation of soldiers equipped for conquest, and that only, who had brought with them neither artists nor architects, but like other nations of Turanian origin, they had strong architectural instincts, and having a style of their own, they could hardly go wrong in any architectural project they might attempt. At some place, he says, those minarets fell off because faulty constructions, because the Hindu architects, artisans could not understand the directions given by the generals of the invading Turks. Why would he make this conclusion? He says they were of Turanian blood, more or less pure. And what about Indians? They found them, they means the Turks found among their new subjects an infinite number of artists quite capable of carrying out any design that might be propounded to them, indirectly is admitting that India had an architectural tradition, without which how can you have such a large number of artists? See, this large number of artists, this is evident from the testimony of Taimur and the testimony of Ghazni. Both of them had carried large number of Indian architects and artisans to work as slave labor in their respective capitals. This is what Mohammed Ghazni, who invaded India some 17 times around the year 1000 AD, had to say about Mathura. Mohammed Ghazni, I'm saying 200 years prior to Qutbuddin Aibak, I'm saying, India several times looting and destroying cities and temples. And after the sack of Mathura, he wrote to the governor of Ghazni, extolling the magnificence of the buildings in that city, and also claiming that he destroyed the city. There are here, Ghazni wrote, 1,000 edifices as firm as the faith of the faithful. See the superlative compliment he gives, as firm as the faith of the faithful. Nor is it likely that this city has attained its present condition, but at the expense of many millions of dinars, nor could such another be constructed under a period of 2 centuries. There is no exaggeration in this statement, because even our Halebeedu temple, if you see, the ornate carvings that you see on the walls, it is said it took about 2 centuries to complete. Generations and generations after keep working in them, and the king would support them. That's how these arts grew in India. And when Mohammed Ghazni returned to Ghazni, he brought back 5,300 Hindu captives, doubtless a greater number of them masons and craftsmen, for building a magnificent mosque of marble and granite, known by the name of the Celestial Bride, which he caused to be built in to commemorate his triumphs. And AlBiruni's testimony. AlBiruni accompanied Mohammed Ghazni. He was a scholar. AlBiruni noted, the Arab historian who visited India in the beginning of the 11th century, along with Mohammed Ghazni, and knowing all the architectural splendor of Baghdad at the height of its glory, before it was laid waste by the Mongols, expressed this astonishment at the and admiration for the works of Hindu builders. AlBiruni wrote, our people, he said, when they see them, wonder at them, and are unable to describe them, much less to construct anything like them. Contrast this with Ferguson. What does Ferguson say? He's talking about some other building in Europe, in Persia. He says, the palace at Mashita, if completed, might have rivaled the Hagia Sophia, which is in Turkey, but it is a fragment. The building that he is referring to is a fragment against when compared with Hagia Sophia. And there may be, certainly were, examples in Persia between the times of Khosrow and Harun al-Rashid, which may have equaled this, but they have perished or at least are not known to us now. See, is referring to a conjecture that there may have been a great buildings, edifices there in Persia, but we have no knowledge of that. And even if they ever existed, must have been unlike these mosques. What does that mean? If you accept this statement, these mosques are not modeled after the great buildings of Persia, if at all they existed. In them, we find a curious exemplification of some of the best qualities of the art as exhibited previously by the Hindus and practiced afterwards by their conquerors. The conquerors had no idea of art. They were conquerors and equipped for that purpose only. They were ferocious people. Their consciousness would not rise above the navel. Their idea of life, enjoyment stops there. And what do you say that India had infinite number of artists, had an architectural tradition, but the quality or the grandeur you would attribute to them. This is Taimur. Taimur sacked Delhi in 1398. He is the 6th generation predecessor of Babur. Taimur has documented his life story, his autobiography. And therefore we get very clear insights into his mind and his works. Writes Taimur in his autobiography, I ordered that all the artisans and clever mechanics who were masters of their crafts should be picked out from among their prisoners and set aside. And accordingly, some thousands of craftsmen were selected to await my command. All these I distributed among the princes and amirs who were present or who were engaged officially in other parts of my dominions. I had determined to build a Masjid-e-Jami in Samarkand, the seat of my empire, which should be without a rival in any country. So I ordered that all builders and stonemasons should be set apart for my own special service. The masjid that he built, its dome can be photographed. The masjid still exists, but then it may not be the original masjid, but the dome seems to be the original dome which he has built. But if at all he had built something, it is through the architects and the stone masons of India. This is his admission, his own admission. How do you say that the Samarkand architecture is not influenced by India? It is the Indian art and architecture that went from India to Samarkand. But Ferguson's conclusion, you see what is Ferguson says. It is probable that very considerable light will yet be thrown upon the origin of the style which the Mughals introduced in India. Did the Mughals introduce it? Or was it India which introduced the Mughal style? From an examination of the buildings erected at Samarkand by Taimur 100 years before Babur's time. Please note that he had not even examined it. He says, yet very considerable light will yet be thrown upon the origin of the style. He says, now that city is in the hands of Russians, that is Samarkand, it is accessible to Europeans. Its buildings have been drawn and photographed but not yet described as to be available for scientific purposes. But he draws conclusions without examining it. Though a frightful savage in most respects, Taimur was possessed of a true Turkey love for noble architecture. He compliments the barbarian. He says a true Turkey love for noble architecture. And though he generally massacred the inhabitants of any town that resisted him, he always spared the architects and artists. To say that he spared the architects and artists and sent them to work on the embellishment of his capitals. Samarkand was consequently filled with splendid edifices, but so far as can be judged from the materials available, more resembling in style those of Persia than anything now known to exist in India. He says that also. He says it belongs to Persian style, not Indian style. This is his own conclusion. So far as can be judged from the materials available, it is more resembling in style to those of Persia than anything now known to exist in India. The Bulbas Dome appears everywhere, he says. What is the meaning of this? The Bulbas Dome is a Persian architecture and was not known at that time in India. How do you know that? How do you know that it did not exist in India? Havel questions Ferguson's work on the classification of medieval Indian architecture. In his book on Indian architecture, published in 1913, he wrote, "The history of architecture is not, as Ferguson thought, the classification of buildings in archaeological watertight compartments according to arbitrary academic ideas of style, but a history of national life and thought. Unless there is a live tradition, a king cannot build beautiful buildings. It is not the order of a king that causes the building. Anybody who has supervised at least the interior decoration of one's own house would know that it is very difficult to convey an idea if the other person doesn't have a sensitivity for it. What the owner wants and what the builder or the interior fellow understands are many times are quite different. So unless there is a live tradition which can respond, a king cannot build. But Ferguson says that by an order of a king, he can build. At the same time, I'm continuing, at the same time, Ferguson's authority among archaeologists has been so great that his views of Indian history have never been seriously disputed. And the ever-increasing quantity of most valuable material collected by the Archaeological Survey of India year by year is still religiously docketed and labeled according to the scheme laid down by him 40 years ago. That was 1913 or 50 years earlier to that. It started docketing like that and it continues that way even today. Look at what the Indian authors have been writing in more recent times. This is Satish Garg, a very reputed historian. Look at what he's saying. The Qutub Minar at Delhi, the city of Fatehpur Sikri, and the Taj Mahal. are all undoubtedly and distinctly Islamic. Satish Garg's book on the architecture of India, Islamic. He says Qutub Minar, Fatehpur Sikri, Taj Mahal are undoubtedly and distinctly Islamic. Now, complimenting Akbar, he says, under Akbar's benevolent but powerful guiding hand, all that is best in the building tradition of India suddenly came to life. Humayun had brought back from his exile couriers and craftsmen brimming with Persian ideas. He barely survived, but he returned to India when Sher Shah Suri died and he took over. But he says that he brought craftsmen brimming with Persian ideas. During Akbar's rule, these were blended with Hindu and Buddhist traditions into a style as unique as the eclectic personality of Akbar. This is seen at its best in Humayun's tomb at Delhi and the numerous structures of Akbar's new capital city at Fatehpur Sikri and his own tomb at Sikandara. See, he covers all the three major architectures attributed to Akbar. This is Fatehpur Sikri. In the Fatehpur Sikri, this marble edifice, it is called Saleem Chisti's Dargah. Saleem Chisti was a mentor for Akbar. So he built a Dargah for him. But look at it, the entire background is of red stone. And the Chisti's Dargah is of marble. It doesn't gel, at least to my eyes, it doesn't gel with the background. It is an imposition. It is a superposition. And the Dargah is something, this is the closer view of the Dargah. You see, there is not even a compound, but there is a marble laid on the ground. It is a clear imposition on a red stone envelope. Akbar specializes in building. I don't think he built the entire Fatehpur Sikri for sure. The very name Fatehpur Sikri indicates Fateh means victory. Sikri is the name of the town. It belonged to the Sikarwar Rajputs. Akbar conquered it and occupied it. And having occupied, he made some buildings there. And he specializes in building the entrances. Look at this main entrance to a building which contains domes. There are 3 domes. The central dome is larger, but the entrance completely blocks the main dome. Would anybody build a dome and then block it? Or if you are going to block it, would you build a dome in the first place? Akbar could do it. And Akbar could impose this kind of buildings in the red stone environment. This kind of marble buildings upon the red stone environment. It is the same main entrance which derives support. Look at this place. It derives support from the main dome. It is a clear imposition upon an existing edifice. More, Akbar has built, it is said that Akbar built this main entrance to the fort. This is called Buland Darwaza. Buland means tall. In fact, a very tall main entrance to the fort of Fatehpur Sikri. It is highly disproportionate. No person with a sense of aesthetics would build this kind of an entrance to this kind of a fort. but Akbar could do it. And if you call it Akbar's architecture, that is fine. But the entire city was not built by Akbar. It was an occupied city. Had he built it himself, he would not have vacated it after a few years. Because he vacated, it is said, he vacated it because of water shortage. The city was small. It could not accommodate entire Akbar's retinue. And Akbar's empire was growing. So he needed a larger capital. So he left this. He went to Agra. This is the rear side view of the Buland Darwaza. You see the disproportion in size. And this is Jama Masjid in Delhi. This is said to have been built by Shah Jahan. If Shah Jahan had built it, he had borrowed the Bulbas Dome from the Taj Mahal. It is not exactly like the Taj Dome. It is embellished in a slightly different way. Its finial is different, the top finial I'm talking about. But he tried to copy that, yes. But he also tried to follow his grandfather by blocking the front view of the main dome. He certainly copied the minarets, but these are not like Taj minarets. So he made a structure out of this. If he had built the entire building himself, perhaps yes. But to conclude that Shah Jahan was the one who was behind the Taj Mahal, and Shah Jahan is the one who is behind this building, and what he learned in the Taj Mahal, in building the Taj Mahal, he had forgotten it here for sure. Because aesthetically, it is just not comparable to the Taj Mahal. One of the major things that I would say is the main dome is blocked. In fact, in the Taj Mahal, this is Jama Masjid only, but in the Taj Mahal, if you see, the main dome is completely visible. The main entrance is far away. You enter through the main entrance, stand in front of the main entrance and look at the building, and the building appears in full glory. And that is the idea of the garden in between, that you can separate the entrance and the building so that the building comes out in full glory. Later on, this was called the Mughal garden. Today's classification, Ferguson's classification is that this type of gardens are Mughal gardens. But these gardens are not, this type of gardens are not there in Sikandara, not there in Akbar's architecture, Humayun's tomb. So it started with Taj Mahal. So my question is, should we disbelieve Shah Jahan when he says very explicitly through two documents, the Badshah Nama, which is a court history, stating explicitly that the building known as the Palace of Raja Man Singh, at present owned by Raja Jai Singh, was selected for the burial of the queen whose abode is in heaven. Should we disbelieve that? Is it not a historical document? And 2 years later, on December 28, 1632, 2 years later, his court farman transfers 4 Havelis to Raja Jai Singh. The mansions detailed below, which belong to the august crown property, have been offered to that pride of peers and the vassal of the monarch of Islam, Raja Jai Singh, and are hereby handed over and transferred to his ownership in exchange for the mansion formerly belonging to Raja Man Singh, which that pride of the grandees willingly and voluntarily donated for the mausoleum of that queen, Maqbara of the queen. Should we disbelieve? Should we question this? But today's history questions this. Today's history does not accept these as historical documents and says Shah Jahan built Taj Mahal. Ferguson's own judgment of the style of Taj Mahal is that it is very distinct from that of the Mughal architecture. When you go to the microscopic level, he makes these statements. He says, certainly when the same people following the same religion built temples and palaces in the same locality, nothing of the sort ever occurred in any country whose history is now known to us. He is talking about the break in the styles of Akbar and that of Shah Jahan. He said nothing of that sort ever occurred in any country whose history is now known to us. Because Taj Mahal is uniquely different from Akbar's architecture. He also makes another statement, equally strong statement, that Shah Jahan's architecture, read it as Taj Mahal, is quite distinct from Aurangzeb's architecture, says Ferguson. But the difference between the two monuments, that is the Taj Mahal and Bibi Ki Maqbara built by Aurangzeb, even in so short an interval, is startling. The first stands alone in the world for certain qualities all can appreciate. The second is by no means remarkable for any qualities of elegance or design and narrowly escapes vulgarity and bad taste. He says, how can this happen? When a father has built this, there must have been a live tradition. Why is that Aurangzeb was not able to build something similar? He says, narrowly escapes vulgarity and bad taste, whereas Taj Mahal is unique in the history of mankind. So what do we make out of this? Ferguson says Mughal style is represented by the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is the epitome of Mughal style and he describes Mughal style based on that. However, from what we have studied, it is very evident that Taj Mahal is not Mughal style. You remove Taj Mahal, then you get the Mughal style. The Humayun's tomb of Akbar, the Sikandara built by Akbar, the Moti Masjid of Shah Jahan, Bashahi Mosque built by Aurangzeb in Delhi, Bibi Ki Maqbara built by Aurangzeb in Aurangabad, these should be taken as the representative buildings of the Mughal style. Whereas the Taj Mahal is uniquely different. It contains ornamental minarets which have been copied by Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb after they commandeered the building. It contains the Bulbas Dome, which was also copied in the Moti Masjid and Badshahi Mosque and Bibi Ki Maqbara. The semi-domed arches, the same thing. The Mughal garden starts with Taj Mahal. The Hindu symbolism, there are numerous Hindu symbolism which are not explained in a Mughal architecture at all. If this is the case, how did the legend come to replace history? Please note, this is a quotation from Ferguson's book, page 360. He is referring to the Taj Mahal as a pleasure palace, not as a tomb, as a pleasure palace. Look at the words. When used as a baradari or pleasure palace, it is his words. It must always have been the coolest and loveliest of garden retreats. And now that it is sacred to the dead, it is the most graceful and the most impressive of the sepulchres of the world. Sepulchre means tomb. When used as a pleasure palace, it must have been the coolest and loveliest of garden retreats. Now, pray, who used it as pleasure palace? Did Shah Jahan use it as pleasure palace? No. It must have been Raja Man Singh only. And this he is saying in 1855, which he repeated in 1867 and 1876 in the three different books which he wrote. It was also quoted in the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1875. It was omitted later by 1910, which is also significant. It was also quoted by Murray's Handbook to India and Ceylon, published in 1891. What does this mean? It means that this knowledge of the Taj Mahal being a pleasure palace earlier was current during the second half of the 19th century. See what Muhammad Latif had to say in 1896. Says Latif that the building was originally a palace of Raja Man Singh, but now it was the property of his grandson Raja Jai Singh. His Majesty gave the Raja a lofty edifice from the Khalsa estate in exchange of this building. There is a factual error. It is not one edifice. He gave 4 havelis. But for that. And the spot was used for the mausoleum of the deceased empress. Now he subtly changed the word. Palace of Raja Man Singh, and the spot was used, he says. This is how it started changing. This is in 1896. But that it was Raja Man Singh's palace was current until the end of 19th century. By 1910, the 11th edition of the encyclopedia omitted this term pleasure palace. But in 1896, Muhammad Latif was still calling it originally a palace of Raja Man Singh. And by 1913, when Havel was writing, Havel did not have any questions about Shah Jahan building the Taj Mahal. He accepted that Shah Jahan actually built the Taj Mahal. So if you are talking about the Mughal style, of course, the Mughals had several kings, rulers from Delhi. The first 6 of them are the most notable. The later 13 of them were not so important. They did not build much, they did not conquer much, they did not rule much. By 1857, the Mughal dynasty was almost effete. It was Babur in 1526 is credited with Baburi Masjid in Ayodhya. Then Humayun did not build much. So his period was about 10-11 years. And after that, another 12 years of break. And then it comes Akbar. Akbar built Humayun's tomb at the beginning of his reign. Because Humayun died and Akbar took over, and soon after that he must have built the Humayun's tomb. And Akbar also built his own tomb at the end of his career. He ruled until 1605. So around that time he must have built the Sikandar. Shah Jahan, Jahangir did not build much. Shah Jahan built something, but the most important thing he did was to commandeer Taj Mahal. But then he built several buildings after that. The Jama Masjid of Delhi is attributed to him. That is 1656. 1650 to 56, Jama Masjid was built, it is said. It is certainly after he completed his work in the Taj Mahal. But qualitatively, it is quite inferior. See the vertical axis, I'm showing quality. This is not to the scale, but something of an indicator. If you look at the quality of the various structures of of the Mughal architectural style, starting from Babri Masjid to Bibi Ki Maqbara of Aurangzeb, they measure up to a level. But the Taj Mahal measures far beyond. It is quite impossible to build one building which is exceptional in the whole line, because building a masterpiece requires support from the society in terms of expertise, in terms of tradition, in terms of the understanding of the whole style, architecture, by not one person, not the chief architect alone, no. It has to be by an army of architects who can understand the command given from the top. The king can permit it, he can support it financially. But if Shah Jahan were to be responsible for the Taj Mahal, he is also responsible to the Jama Masjid Delhi, and we can compare the two. Taj Mahal is supposed to be earlier and Jama Masjid is supposed to be later. Yeah, so my own assessment is that Taj Mahal belongs to an earlier period. And if you trust the carbon dating done by Marvin Mills, he talks about 1359 plus or minus 89 years. That's about 300 years early. But there is one more thing to mention here. The architecture of the Taj Mahal is not that of a palace. See, any building is built for a purpose. If you build a palace, it should have bedrooms, it should have toilets, it should have bathrooms, it should have many other things, kitchens. The Taj Mahal does not appear to have been built as a palace for sure. The underground chambers that you see are not residential places of a king. It is not meant for that. It doesn't appear to be that. But it was built for certain purpose, but somebody else commandeered it and put to use for something. The mosque that you see on the western side of the building, we see that it is been put to use as a mosque, but it doesn't orient itself to the Mecca, which the Quran commands. And you see several plaques removed and replaced. You see the artificial pulpits built there, and you see the patchwork being very crude. And you see that the Jawab on the opposite side is not containing that kind of a pulpit or anything. Pulpit breaks the pattern. They are superimpositions. They might have put to use as mosque because it is on the western side. But it is not built as a tomb. It is not built as a palace. And the architecture eminently fits that of a temple. If you look at the drum houses, if you look at the symbolism of the carvings, if you look at the Rajput symbols of welcome, and if you see the carvings on the walls, the nature of the carvings, they are not Islamic carvings. And if you say drum houses near a mosque, it is an impossibility. Nor is a tomb a place for festivity around the year. It is not. In a tomb, what happens at the most is an urus once a year. So you won't build elaborate drum houses for that purpose. Whereas in a Shiva temple, the drums are an everyday affair. Added to that, there is a Gaushala. Gaushala is a Sanskrit name. Why should Shah Jahan add a Gaushala to the tomb? It remained as an indicator, as a trace of an earlier era. So its architecture appears to be that of a temple. In fact, when was it built? Who built it? Who caused it? It is very difficult to say. Unless we do further research based on the actual time identified scientifically. We must use carbon dating, thermoluminescence test, and all kinds of tests, so that without doubt we know the date on which it was constructed. Then we can find out who constructed it. In fact, P.N. Oak says this, that in Munda Bateshwar, there was an inscription retrieved. He says it was kept in the Lucknow Museum, but I could not get it from the website of the Lucknow Archaeological Survey website belonging to Lucknow. I could not get it, but he says that it was in the Lucknow Museum, ASI Museum, which says that the inscription says that the king has built two temples, one belonging to Vishnu, another belonging to Shiva. Referring to the Shiva temple, it says that it is of white marble, into which Lord Shiva came from Kailas and sat, and then he forgot Kailas itself. This building is facing south, but the deity from the north and worshipping from the south is perfectly right in the Vastu. So that is where I would conclude. And very last point I would make is, this is the very first point I made in my very first slide. Rabindranath Tagore termed it as a tear on the face of eternity. I would certainly agree with that. If Taj Mahal represents anything, it is a tear of this motherland for a different reason. Not the reason of Shah Jahan, but it's a different reason, because it signifies the rape of this land. I would recall what Will Durant has said in his Story of Civilization. It is a warning. We better heed this warning. That is the purpose of study of history. Says Durant, the Mohammedan conquest of India is probably the bloodiest story in history. It is a discouraging tale, for its evident moral is that civilization is a precarious thing whose delicate complex of order and liberty, culture and peace may at any time be overthrown by barbarians invading from without or multiplying within. Those who do not study history are condemned to relive it. So said George Santayana. Okay, I have completed my presentation. If there are any comments or questions, I would be happy to hear.
Hello. Hi, this is Anand.
Yeah.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
About this mosque, right? Not facing the correct direction.
Yes.
I probably disagree on that, because I actually, so the thing is, I know Marvin Mills said that, but I think he ignored the fact that Earth is not round. It's actually a apple shape. So if you go, I actually have a paper on that. I've written it. There are two things. You can actually go to Islam, this thing, and look at the Qibla of Agra, and it actually does come out to be the west exactly. And then I also wanted to make sure that it is not like they have corrupted their own information, because Agra has this controversial Taj Mahal. So actually, if you go to Google, and you do a geodesic between, geodesic is the shortest distance, right? Because what Muslims want is Qibla should be facing in the direction which is the shortest distance. So if you do the shortest distance between Agra and Makkah, it actually comes out to be correct, which is facing exactly west. So I can send you that paper. So I think that particular point is not correct of Marvin Mills.
I think I have read your paper.
Yeah.
I have seen your paper. The paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have any comment on that?
No, my comment as well, I already said. I stand by what I have said. You can disagree.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I disagree. At least you, I hope you can show the analysis. Like Qibla, when we define, the Muslims, when they define Qibla, why is it that the west direction is not correct? If you show some analysis, I can look at it.
Yeah, you should show me why the mosque is being altered so much. You were not present during my third part, were you?
Well, I got that late. I had talked with Harinath. I mean, Harinath can testify for that. I asked him, and then by the time he sent, but I did listen to your talk, at least more than half. And since I noted this mosque direction, I wanted to point it out to you that at least that point is not correct. I'm not saying I don't want to make any claims about the Taj Mahal. I just want to say that that particular point, that the mosque is not facing the correct direction, is not correct. That's all I want to say. I don't want to make any other bigger points or claims beyond that.
Yeah, I have made my point in my presentation on the third part, beginning. There are several points. I said that this mosque has been altered. It has been an existing building put to use for that purpose. I have no complaint if it is pointing exactly to the west also, even though my queries will remain unanswered.
And as I said, I don't want to make anything beyond. I just want to say that this point, that it is not pointing to the right direction, is not correct. Fine. Maybe it was an altered building. That is fine. I don't want to make any comments about that.
Fine, fine. You can hold this view. I don't have any problem in that.
Well, I hope it's not like just a view or belief. It's actually analysis. That you have to look at what is the Qibla and see, and the Qibla is correct.
Anand, that is one point. Qibla means, can you explain what is Qibla?
Yeah, so see, Qibla is the direction in which Muslims are supposed to pray, and the direction is always pointing towards Makkah, no matter where you are in the world. So for example, it's a very big thing for them that what is the Qibla, they will ask. So for example, in New York, the Qibla is, I think, going over the Arctic Circle or something, so that it is looking towards Makkah. And that is because going over the Arctic Circle is the shortest distance to Makkah. So Qibla is basically anywhere on earth, what is the direction which has the shortest distance to Makkah? That is how Qibla is defined. Right, sir?
No, I do not know.
Yeah, I have looked at it. I looked at exactly what they mean by Qibla and how they build the mosques. I also checked our Dallas mosque, because that also is in a little bit, these days with Google Maps, you can really check out what direction they're pointing and whether it is the correct Qibla or not. So, that's how Qibla is defined.
Anand, I have no quarrel with you on the direction of whether Qibla coincides with the cardinal west.
Yes.
You can, I mean, you may be right also. I'm not questioning that. But my reasons to say that this is a commandeered building has been presented in my third presentation, third part. And the picture that I am posing here was discussed there.
Like I said, I'm just pointing out to you that since you used it, even after reading my paper, I just wanted to tell you that that is based on actual analysis. It's not a belief or inferences. It's actual analysis, mathematical analysis is what it is. Yeah.
That is about one point about Qibla.
Yes.
Let us accept that your analysis is right.
Good.
I still differ that to the extent that this is a commandeered building for the reasons I have discussed here.
That's fine.
Qibla is to the west. Okay.
Yeah, I have no comments about the other part. Yeah.
Don't comment. Yeah. Any other comments, please?
No, sir.
Sir, good evening. This is Deshpande. Thank you for your insight into Taj Mahal. Sir, actually, whatever we are seeing in history, this Taj Mahal or this Ram Janmabhoomi, Ayodhya, Mathura, and this Varanasi, where the existing Hindu temples or structures were demolished, the superstructures were demolished, and using the column and foundation, they have built their superstructures, especially the Islamic rulers, and they continue. But this we are not seeing in South India. During the same period of Mughals, the South India, very huge temples, they are there in Tamil Nadu, Srirangam. We have in Kerala, this Thiruvananthapuram. We have in Karnataka. But was it the fact that the Mughals or the North Indian rulers, Delhi rulers, sultans, they did not enter into South India, or the resistance from South Indian kings during that time was very high, more powerful than whatever we talk of Rajputs in North India, so that these were protected? It's my doubt. Kindly clarify it.
Now the ruler, the Islamic rule was mainly concentrated on the North India, on the north of Vindhyas, you can say. South India, there were sultans, Bahmani sultans, and Bijapur sultans, Bidar. All these places were occupied at various times, but their hegemony over the South India, which manifested when they were combined, happened in Hampi. But they did not occupy the whole of South India for a very extended period. Whereas the North India was almost entirely occupied and ruled for a very prolonged period of time. And during that time, several temples have been destroyed, several temples have been converted into the mosque. But in South, it did not happen so much. As you said, in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, we don't see these atrocities so much. And we still have very major edifices there, buildings there, temples there. They still exist. For example, you already mentioned the Thiruvananthapuram temple or Srirangam, and then Chidambaram, and then Rameshwaram.
Yeah, Hoysala's, Halebeedu, Belur, and all this.
There were attacks, yes. Malik Kafur came to Karnataka also.
Yeah.
But it is said that the Halebeedu was covered by haystacks.
Mm.
And he did not notice them, so it escaped his attention.
Sir,
But Srirangam was attacked.
Mm.
Srirangam was attacked. There is a video by Sadhguru on Srirangam, how it was attacked and how they tried to save.
so the reason, sir, my perspective, the reason is what you alluded to, but I think the reason will be as they came down, so they faced more and more resistance. And it took more time for them to come down. But then Marathas came up after that. I think a large part of, in my opinion, Marathas saved to a large extent. If that resistance from Marathas had not been there, and if Mughals had come down freely, I think South India also probably would have faced the same fate.
Yeah. Okay.
Before that, Vijayanagar kings were powerful. They were ruling, and even the Tamil Nadu kings were very powerful.
And those kingdoms were considered to be very rich compared to the North Indian kingdoms.
So that is difficult to say, because North India by that time was already under Islamic rule. So
That is very difficult.
In the sense of richness, or in the sense of trade, whatever they had, gold, diamond, precious stones, and all that, what these people, Chinese people, they write it, the Vijayanagara's glory and all this. So those they were rich kingdoms, but they did not attract the atrocities of North rulers. I feel so. I don't know.
Yeah. You see the end of Vijayanagara. End of Vijayanagara came, and there were ransacking of Hampi continued for 5 months, they say. And there was a widespread destruction there. and depopulation also. Vijayanagara was strong for 200 years. It resisted the attack. But then the combined effort of those four sultanates in Bijapur, Bahmani, Golconda, and those four,
But
they
it's
came together and
yeah.
defeated Vijayanagara, and then there was restriction. For 200 years there was not, but then after that there was. So, but prolonged occupation in the south was not there as much as the north. That's what it is.
Yeah, I'd like to add this. Hi, this is Anand Deshpande, sir. So I think as Bhatt sir said, right, it's the extent to which the destruction happened. I mean, it's just less, but it's not like it was not there. There is a very good book by Meenakshi Jain. She's a professor in Delhi University. So she has written a book on flight of deities and rebirth of temples. So there she gives a list of all the temples in India where the deities were hidden. So for example, the Madurai deity, I think, was hidden when the North Indians, the Muslims came to attack from the north. So it's a very interesting book because it gives all the references of the different temples that were destroyed and rebuilt. So for example, even the Mahalakshmi temple in Kolhapur, there also the deity was hidden and it was rebuilt later. So if you have time, you can refer to her book actually, Meenakshi Jain.
Okay. Yeah.
Sir, good evening. This is Nagi. I had one question. So whenever we sort of think of Indian temples and all those, right, pillars comes out as one unique feature. And similarly, whenever you think of the various palaces of the kings and all that thing, what at least I have noticed is there have been palaces with domes and all that. Even our own Lalit Mahal palace has some kind of a dome. But have there been other palaces with minarets in them? Like which other architecture, temples or palaces or anything, any other edifice had a minaret kind of structure in them?
I don't know. I don't know. Let me not venture into this. I don't know.
Okay.
No, whether there are anything that can be compared right now, we don't know. No, my study doesn't extend to that far. I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, sir. So I was wondering why was only this structure, how come it had minarets, not many others? That was also my thought process.
Okay. Any other question or comment from the audience?
Yeah, actually related to these minarets, I mean, I have not compared, but Hagia Sophia also has 4 on the side, right? If I'm not wrong. They're taller than the central one, but I think Hagia Sophia has 4 on the side.
Yeah, it is there. Correct.
Yeah.
That is in Turkey.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So any other comment, question? If not, if not, we'll end the session now. Thank you very much, sir, for this very insightful talk. Thanks everyone from the audience who attended these sessions. Nagi, let's end the session with a Shanti mantra, please. Thank you.
Okay. Namaste. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah. Sarve santu niramaya. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. Ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.